She vanished without a trace. The LeeAnna Warner disappearance case. On a warm June afternoon in 2003, a small Minnesota town became the center of a mystery that has never been solved. For nearly 2 decades, investigators chased thousands of leads. Search teams combed forests, abandoned mine pits, and quiet neighborhoods. The FBI joined the investigation. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension devoted years to the case. Age-progressed images were created in the hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize the little girl who had seemingly vanished into thin air. Despite one of the largest missing child investigations in Minnesota history, 5-year-old LeeAnna Marie Warner has never been found. No confirmed sightings, no verified ransom demand, no physical evidence explaining where she went. Only questions. Questions that have haunted her family, investigators, and the community of Chisholm for more than 20 years. How does a child disappear in the middle of the afternoon from a quiet neighborhood? Did someone know she would be walking alone that day? Or did a chance encounter forever change the course of one little girl's life? Even after thousands of interviews and years of investigative work, no one has been arrested. The mystery remains, but the investigation has never truly stopped. Every few years, detectives return to old evidence with fresh eyes. Technology improves. Witnesses reconsider forgotten memories. New generations learn LeeAnna's story, because investigators believe someone still knows what happened that afternoon. Someone has the missing piece, and until that person comes forward, LeeAnna's story remains unfinished. This is the story of a little girl who disappeared without a trace, and the community that has never stopped looking for her. Before we go further, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Someone watching may remember the summer of 2003, or may know someone from northern Minnesota who recalls this case. Before LeeAnna became one of Minnesota's best-known missing children, she was simply a little girl enjoying summer vacation. LeeAnna Marie Warner was born in 1998. She lived with her family in the small mining community of Chisholm, Minnesota, located on the state's Iron Range. Chisholm is the kind of town where neighbors know one another. Children often played outside together. Parents recognized familiar faces on nearby streets. For many families, it felt like a safe place to raise children. LeeAnna's family described her as energetic and friendly. According to information released by investigators and missing person organizations, she enjoyed riding her bicycle and spending time outdoors with neighborhood children. She had just completed kindergarten. Summer vacation had only recently begun. Like many children her age, every day offered another opportunity to play outside before returning home for dinner. Nothing about June 14, 2003, seemed unusual. The weather was pleasant. Children filled neighborhood yards. Families carried on with ordinary weekend routines. There was no reason for anyone to believe that this ordinary Saturday would become one of the darkest days in the town's history. The Warner family had plans that afternoon. LeeAnna spent part of the day with relatives before returning home. As the afternoon continued, she wanted to visit a nearby friend. The friend's home was only a short distance away. It was a walk she had made before. According to investigators, LeeAnna left home during the afternoon, intending to visit that friend's house. She never arrived. At first, no one panicked. Children sometimes stopped to play. They talked with friends. They became distracted. But as the minutes passed, concern quickly grew. Family members began searching the neighborhood themselves. They checked nearby yards, parks, friends' homes, places where children naturally gathered. No one had seen LeeAnna. Soon, local police were notified. What initially appeared to be a routine search for a missing child rapidly became something far more serious. Officers responded immediately. Additional agencies were contacted. Neighbors left their homes to help search. As daylight began fading, volunteers spread throughout Chisholm, hoping to find any sign of the little girl. Investigators later reconstructed LeeAnna's likely route that afternoon. The distance between her home and her friend's house was short, only a matter of blocks. Yet somewhere along that brief walk, something happened. What happened has remained unknown ever since. Unlike many missing person investigations, detectives found no verified evidence that LeeAnna had intentionally wandered into the surrounding wilderness. Search teams examined wooded areas, fields, and abandoned mining locations with remarkable thoroughness. Tracking dogs were brought in. Volunteers searched repeatedly. Law enforcement expanded the search well beyond Chisholm's city limits. Still, nothing. As the hours turned into days, Minnesota authorities recognized they were no longer dealing with a child who was simply lost. They were confronting the possibility that LeeAnna had been abducted. That realization transformed the investigation. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension became heavily involved. The FBI joined the effort. Posters carrying LeeAnna's smiling photograph appeared across the region. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Newspapers printed her image on front pages throughout Minnesota. Every passing day reduced the likelihood that the investigation would end with a simple explanation. Instead, it became one of the state's most enduring mysteries. Now that you know who LeeAnna Warner was before she disappeared, does she remind you of someone in your own family? Tell me in the comments. Keeping LeeAnna's memory alive begins with remembering the little girl she was not, just the mystery she left behind. For investigators, the next challenge would be reconstructing every minute of June 14, 2003. Every witness, every vehicle, every conversation, every possible sighting. Because somewhere within those ordinary moments, they believed the answer was waiting. Somewhere between LeeAnna Warner's home and the house she intended to visit, the trail ended. Investigators have spent years trying to determine exactly what happened during those few minutes on the afternoon of June 14, 2003. It was a distance that should have taken only moments to walk. Yet those moments became the center of one of Minnesota's most enduring missing child investigations. The first officers who responded began with the most immediate possibility. Perhaps LeeAnna had become distracted while playing. Perhaps she had wandered into a wooded area nearby. Perhaps she had taken a different route. Those possibilities were explored almost immediately. Family members, neighbors, firefighters, police officers, and volunteers searched throughout Chisholm. Children who had been outside that afternoon were interviewed. Residents checked garages, sheds, abandoned buildings, and nearby parks. Everyone hoped the explanation would be simple. It wasn't. As the search expanded, authorities requested additional resources from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Within hours, search teams were covering areas well beyond LeeAnna's expected route. Tracking dogs were brought to the neighborhood in an effort to follow her scent. Helicopters searched from above. Officers checked lakes, wooded areas, old mining property, trails, and fields surrounding Chisholm. Nothing suggested that LeeAnna had simply become lost. No clothing, no bicycle, no personal belongings. No verified physical evidence indicating where she had gone. For experienced investigators, that absence was troubling. Children who wander away are often found relatively close to where they were last seen. LeeAnna wasn't. That fact caused detectives to broaden the investigation considerably. Attention shifted toward the possibility that someone had encountered LeeAnna while she was walking. Every registered vehicle in the area became important. Residents were asked whether they had noticed unfamiliar cars driving slowly through the neighborhood. Investigators interviewed hundreds of people during the first days of the investigation. Every possible sighting was documented. Every timeline was checked. Authorities later confirmed that thousands of leads would eventually be reviewed as the investigation continued. Some leads appeared promising at first. Witnesses reported seeing vehicles they considered unusual. Others believed they remembered seeing someone speaking with a young child. Each report required detectives to verify times, locations, and witness reliability before deciding whether it could advance the investigation. Many of those early leads ultimately could not be confirmed. That is one of the greatest challenges in missing child investigations. As news spreads, memories can unintentionally become influenced by media coverage or conversations with others. Investigators therefore rely heavily on corroborating evidence before treating any witness account as established fact. Meanwhile, LeeAnna's family waited. Each hour that passed without news became more difficult than the last. The community continued searching. Businesses displayed missing child posters. Churches organized volunteers. Neighbors refused to believe that a little girl could simply disappear from their town. The search extended into nearby communities. Specialized search and rescue teams examined terrain that had already been searched once before. Areas were revisited repeatedly. Investigators understood that the smallest overlooked detail could become the key to solving the case. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing additional resources and experience with child abduction cases. Federal investigators worked alongside local and state agencies to review evidence, interview witnesses, and evaluate every credible theory supported by the facts. Despite those combined efforts, the investigation produced no confirmed evidence explaining LeeAnna's disappearance. No verified ransom demand was ever made public. No confirmed sightings after the afternoon of June 14 were established. No one came forward admitting involvement. The absence of evidence became one of the defining characteristics of the case. Investigators continued developing multiple investigative theories while avoiding conclusions not supported by evidence. One possibility was that LeeAnna had been abducted by someone passing through the neighborhood. Another considered whether the individual might have had some familiarity with the area. Authorities have never publicly identified a named suspect. Over the years, detectives have repeatedly emphasized that the investigation remains open and active. Because no arrests have been made, investigators have avoided publicly attributing responsibility to any specific individual. That careful approach reflects the standards required in an ongoing criminal investigation. Evidence, not speculation, must guide every conclusion. Investigators had searched neighborhoods, forests, mine property, and followed thousands of leads, yet LeeAnna Warner was still missing. Based on the verified evidence released over the years, what do you think made this case so difficult to solve? Please keep your thoughts respectful and grounded in the known facts. As weeks turned into months, the urgency of the search gradually gave way to something even more difficult: waiting. The active search became a long-term investigation, and for LeeAnna's family, the silence that followed would last not just months, but years. As the first weeks of the investigation came to an end, LeeAnna Warner's disappearance had already become one of the largest missing child cases in Minnesota history. What investigators hoped would be resolved within hours had become a long-term investigation. The emergency search slowly transitioned into something much more methodical. Every interview was reviewed again. Every witness statement was compared against the growing timeline. Every reported sighting was examined to determine whether it could be independently verified. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension remained heavily involved, working alongside the Chisholm Police Department and the FBI. Rather than allowing the case to fade, investigators continued assigning resources to follow new leads whenever they emerged. Throughout the months that followed, detectives received thousands of tips from the public. Some callers believed they had seen LeeAnna after she disappeared. Others reported suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar individuals who had been in the area around June 14th. Every tip had to be investigated. Most ultimately led nowhere. That is often the hidden reality of major missing person investigations. The public sees only the headlines. Investigators see thousands of pages of interviews, reports, maps, timelines, and evidence logs. Many promising leads disappear after careful verification. Some contradict established facts. Others simply cannot be confirmed. LeeAnna's case became exactly that type of investigation, one built as much on eliminating possibilities as discovering new ones. As months became years, search operations did not stop. Instead, they changed. Rather than conducting neighborhood canvasses every day, investigators began organizing targeted searches whenever new information suggested a specific location. Wooded areas were revisited. Old mining lands surrounding Chisholm received renewed attention. Abandoned properties were searched when credible information justified doing so. Technology also improved. Evidence collected during the original investigation was preserved whenever possible. Investigators understood that future forensic advances might reveal information unavailable in 2003. Cold case investigations across the United States had already demonstrated that cases once believed impossible to solve could suddenly produce answers years later. That possibility gave detectives hope. At the same time, LeeAnna's family refused to let the public forget her. Every anniversary brought renewed media attention. Local television stations revisited the investigation. Newspapers published updates reminding readers that the case remained unsolved. Community members organized events honoring LeeAnna and encouraging anyone with information to contact investigators. Age-progressed images were eventually released through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Forensic artists created illustrations showing what LeeAnna might look like as she grew older. The purpose was simple. If she were alive, someone might recognize her. Those images were distributed nationally. They represented hope. Hope that somewhere someone might recognize an adult whose true identity had remained hidden since childhood. Investigators never publicly confirmed evidence supporting any single theory. Instead, they continued emphasizing that every credible lead would be examined. That careful approach reflected years of investigative experience. Detectives understood that publicly focusing on one theory without sufficient evidence could discourage witnesses holding information related to another. Instead, they kept the investigation open, flexible, ready to adapt whenever new evidence appeared. Despite the passage of time, law enforcement repeatedly stated that LeeAnna's case remained active. It had not been forgotten. It had not been abandoned. Every few years, investigators reviewed the evidence again. Fresh detectives examined old files. Advances in forensic science were considered. Witnesses were re-interviewed when appropriate. The hope remained unchanged. Find the answer that had eluded investigators since 2003. For more than 20 years, LeeAnna Warner's family has continued living with unanswered questions. If you've ever waited a long time for justice or for answers in your own life, I invite you to share your story respectfully in the comments. That kind of patience deserves to be recognized. Then, the investigation entered a new phase. Not because investigators had solved the mystery, but because modern technology, renewed public awareness, and the passage of time offered possibilities that simply did not exist when LeeAnna first disappeared. We're about to reach the most recent developments in LeeAnna Warner's case. Before we continue, what do you think could finally provide investigators with the breakthrough they have been searching for all these years? Share your thoughts before we move into the next chapter. Part 4. 2 decades without answers. By the time the investigation reached its first anniversary, one painful reality had become impossible to ignore. LeeAnna Warner was still missing. The neighborhood where she had disappeared looked much the same as it had on that June afternoon in 2003. Children still rode their bicycles through Chisholm. Families still gathered outside during the summer. Life, in many ways, continued. But for LeeAnna's family, time had stopped. Every birthday became another reminder of what should have been. Every Christmas passed without knowing where she was. Every family milestone carried an empty place that no one could fill. For investigators, however, the passing of time did not mean the case was forgotten. Cold cases often receive renewed attention as technology improves. Evidence collected years earlier can sometimes reveal information that was impossible to detect when it was first examined. Witnesses who were once afraid to speak may eventually come forward. People's relationships change. Loyalties fade. Consciences grow heavier. Detectives understood that some of history's most famous missing person cases had been solved decades after the disappearance. That possibility remained alive for LeeAnna. The Chisholm Police Department continued working alongside the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. The FBI also remained available to assist whenever necessary. Rather than closing the file, investigators periodically reopened every major lead. Old witness interviews were reviewed. Timelines were reconstructed again. Evidence was re-examined using improved forensic techniques whenever possible. Officials repeatedly emphasized that no credible lead would be ignored simply because years had passed. As new technologies emerged, investigators explored whether they could provide answers unavailable in 2003. Digital mapping improved. DNA science advanced dramatically. National missing person databases became more comprehensive. Information sharing between agencies expanded. Although no public breakthrough resulted from those developments, detectives believed the investigation benefited from every advancement. Another important part of keeping the case alive came from organizations dedicated to missing children. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children continued featuring LeeAnna's case. Age-progressed images were updated as the years passed. Those images were carefully created using family photographs and forensic art techniques to estimate what LeeAnna might look like as she grew older. The hope was never certainty. The hope was recognition. If LeeAnna were alive, someone might recognize her face. A coworker, a neighbor, a teacher, a friend, someone who had never questioned the story they had been told. Age progression has helped solve missing child cases before. It remains an important investigative tool whenever authorities believe a missing child could still be alive. At the same time, investigators continued receiving tips. Some came from Minnesota, others arrived from different states. Occasionally, people believed they had seen someone resembling the age-progressed images. Every report required careful investigation. Most were ultimately ruled out. Even so, detectives encouraged the public to continue reporting information. One accurate tip could change everything. Throughout the years, investigators have consistently stated that they have never ruled out the possibility that someone possesses critical information without realizing its importance. A conversation remembered years later. An unusual vehicle. Someone behaving differently after June 14, 2003. Details that once appeared meaningless can sometimes become decisive when combined with other evidence. That possibility continues to guide the investigation today. As anniversaries passed, LeeAnna's family spoke publicly whenever possible. Their message remained remarkably consistent. Do not forget LeeAnna. Do not stop sharing her photograph. Do not assume someone else has already reported what you know. For families of missing children, public attention can be one of the most valuable resources investigators have. The more people who recognize a victim's name and face, the greater the possibility that someone with information will finally come forward. Cases that remain in the public eye are often the ones that continue generating new leads. That is one reason documentaries like this continue to be produced. Not to sensationalize tragedy, but to ensure that time does not erase memory. LeeAnna Warner was more than a missing person poster. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, a classmate, a child with dreams that ended before they truly began. Behind every investigative file sits a family still waiting for answers. That reality never changes, even after 20 years. More than 2 decades have passed since LeeAnna disappeared. If this story has touched you, take a moment to write, "We remember LeeAnna" in the comments. Small acts of remembrance help ensure that missing children are never forgotten. As investigators continued reviewing old evidence and following new leads, hope remained. Because history has shown that even the oldest cases can suddenly change. A forgotten witness, a new forensic technique, or one person finally deciding it's time to tell the truth. Then, almost as suddenly as LeeAnna Warner disappeared, the investigation entered a period defined not by dramatic breakthroughs, but by persistence. Cold cases rarely remain completely still. Investigators continued reviewing evidence whenever new technology became available. New detectives were assigned fresh reviews of the original case file. Experienced investigators revisited witness statements collected in 2003, asking whether details that once seemed insignificant might carry new meaning when viewed alongside modern investigative techniques. Although many years had passed, the official position never changed. LeeAnna's case remained open. No suspect was publicly identified, no arrests were made, and no evidence justified closing the investigation. One of the greatest challenges facing detectives was the complete absence of a confirmed trail after LeeAnna was last seen. Unlike many investigations, there was no verified surveillance footage showing where she went. No confirmed eyewitness who watched her enter a vehicle. No forensic evidence publicly linking a suspect to her disappearance. Instead, investigators were left assembling thousands of small pieces of information, hoping that together they would eventually reveal the larger picture. Over the years, law enforcement repeatedly encouraged members of the public to come forward, even if they believed the information they possessed was unimportant. Investigators have often explained that seemingly insignificant memories can become critical years later. Someone may remember seeing a vehicle parked where it normally wasn't. Someone may recall an unusual conversation. Someone may recognize a name that meant nothing in 2003 but carries new significance today. Those possibilities continue to drive the investigation. As technology advanced, age-progressed images of LeeAnna were updated. These images were carefully developed to estimate how she might appear as a teenager and later as an adult. Their purpose was not to suggest investigators believed she was alive or deceased. Rather, they reflected an investigative principle. Until evidence proves otherwise, every credible possibility deserves consideration. Those updated images circulated nationally through missing person organizations, news outlets, and law enforcement agencies. Each release represented renewed hope. Hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize a face they had never realized belonged to a missing child. Meanwhile, the Chisholm community continued honoring LeeAnna's memory. Annual reminders, local news coverage, and public awareness campaigns ensured that her disappearance would not fade from public consciousness. Investigators have consistently acknowledged that community support has helped keep the case active for more than 2 decades. Cases that remain visible often continue generating new leads long after public attention fades elsewhere. For LeeAnna's family, however, awareness has always represented something much more personal. Every article, every documentary, every anniversary, each one is another opportunity for someone with information to finally speak. Because after all these years, investigators continue believing that someone knows what happened on June 14, 2003. Perhaps not everyone involved, perhaps not every detail, but someone knows enough to change the course of this investigation. History has repeatedly shown that long unsolved cases can suddenly change, sometimes through advances in forensic science, sometimes through renewed investigative review, and sometimes because a witness decides they can no longer remain silent. LeeAnna's investigation remains prepared for any of those possibilities. The case file continues to be reviewed. Tips continue to be accepted, and law enforcement continues asking the public for assistance. Although there has been no publicly announced breakthrough leading to an arrest, detectives emphasize that the absence of an arrest should never be mistaken for the absence of hope. Many missing person investigations have remained unsolved for decades before reaching an answer. Investigators understand that every new lead deserves careful evaluation, regardless of how much time has passed. As we approach the end of LeeAnna's story, one truth remains unchanged. She was 5 years old. She left home expecting to visit a friend's house. She never returned. More than 20 years later, her family is still waiting. Waiting for answers, waiting for justice, waiting for the day when the mystery that began on a quiet summer afternoon in Chisholm finally reaches its conclusion. We're about to reach the final chapter of LeeAnna Warner's story. Before we continue, what do you think will ultimately help solve this case? A witness, new forensic technology, or something investigators have overlooked? Share your thoughts respectfully before we finish. On June 14, 2003, 5-year-old LeeAnna Warner left home for what should have been a short walk to a friend's house. She never arrived. More than 2 decades have passed since that summer afternoon in Chisholm, Minnesota. Children who were LeeAnna's age in 2003 are now adults. Neighborhoods have changed. Technology has transformed criminal investigations. New detectives have inherited the case from those who first searched the streets of Chisholm. Yet one thing has remained exactly the same. LeeAnna is still missing. For her family, time has never erased the questions. Every birthday serves as a reminder of the years they never shared. Every holiday carries the hope that someday, somehow, they will finally learn what happened to the little girl they loved. Families of missing children often describe life as being divided into 2 chapters: everything before the disappearance and everything after. For the Warner family, that second chapter has lasted more than 20 years. It is a chapter written with patience, hope, heartbreak, and determination. Throughout those years, law enforcement has consistently emphasized that LeeAnna's investigation remains active. Detectives continue accepting tips. Evidence remains preserved. Investigators remain willing to examine new information, no matter how much time has passed. History has repeatedly shown that justice does not always arrive quickly. Some of America's most well-known cold cases have been solved decades later, not because investigators gave up, but because they refused to. Sometimes the breakthrough comes from improved forensic science, sometimes from newly discovered evidence, sometimes from a witness who finally chooses to speak after years of silence. Investigators believe those possibilities still exist in LeeAnna's case. That is why they continue asking for the public's help. If you lived in or traveled through Chisholm during the summer of 2003, if you remember an unusual vehicle, an unfamiliar person, a conversation that seemed insignificant at the time, or any information connected to LeeAnna Warner's disappearance, authorities encourage you to contact law enforcement. Even details that appear unimportant today may become meaningful when combined with other evidence. No one should assume someone else has already reported what they know. One conversation, one observation, one memory. That is sometimes all it takes to change the course of an investigation. For those of us watching years later, there is another responsibility: to remember. True crime should never become entertainment at the expense of victims. Behind every headline is a real family. Behind every investigation is a child who deserved to grow up. LeeAnna Warner was not simply a case number. She was a little girl with dreams, friendships, and a future that remains unknown. Remembering her means remembering that every missing person's story represents someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's grandchild, someone who mattered. As long as people continue speaking LeeAnna's name, sharing her photograph, and learning her story, the possibility of answers remains alive. That hope is what has carried investigators and her family through more than 2 decades. Hope that one day, the silence will end. Hope that one day, the truth will finally replace uncertainty. Hope that one day, LeeAnna Warner will come home. If this documentary helped you learn about LeeAnna Warner's story, consider sharing it with someone else. Public awareness keeps unsolved cases alive, and you never know who may recognize a detail that helps investigators move one step closer to the truth. Thank you for watching The Silence Evidence. Here, we don't chase rumors. We don't present speculation as fact. We tell verified stories with respect for victims, their families, and the investigators still searching for answers. Because every unsolved case represents more than a mystery. It represents a person who deserves to be found. Every case deserves an answer. Every family deserves the truth.